We are complying with Western price cap. Now, let me tell you something interesting. Russia produces about 10% or thereabouts of the overall oil which is extracted every day, about 10, 11 million barrels a day. If India stops buying whatever it does, or one or two other countries stop buying, Becky, do you know what's going to happen to prices? They're not going to be, then the OPEC Secretary General will not dismiss the idea that prices could reach $250. So there is a Western, I'm not saying understanding, but I talk to my Western interlocutors. They say, be a friend, continue to buy Russian oil, buy it cheaper than you can.
You're right. Mr. Borrell is not with us now, but I really don't see the basis for your question because my understanding of the Council regulations is that if Russian crude is substantially transformed in a third country, then it's not treated as Russian anymore. I would urge you to look at Council Regulation 833/2014.
Have I been told by anyone to stop buying Russian oil? The answer is a categorical no. There is understanding. I mean, if there is an issue of how you want to deal with an evolving geopolitical situation, mature governments can have discussions, and those discussions will take place.
India could take up the Russian offer of discounted crude oil. What would be your message to India or any other country tempted by such an offer?
Well, our message to any country continues to be that obviously abide by the sanctions, but that we have put in place and recommended. I don't believe this would be violating that, but also think about where you want to stand when the history books are written.
India buying Russian crude oil has become a big debate for the West. That India still keeps buying cheap Russian oil, even though it has faced lots of sanctions and criticism from the Western world. Let's understand this in detail. India needs to fulfill its oil needs. India is the world's third largest crude oil consumer after the United States and China, and imports 85% of its needs. Previously, its main suppliers were the Middle East. Now Russia became the number one supplier. In 2023, Russian energy giant Rosneft announced a deal to substantially increase supplies to the Indian oil company, followed by the CEO Sachin visit to India. $3.6 billion by importing discounted Russian crude oil from Russia. Have likely grown more since with the energy cargo trackers reporting that India is purchasing Russian flag Urals crude oil below the $60 per barrel price cap introduced by the G7 in December 2021. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar during his visit in Moscow said, India being the world's third largest consumer of oil and gas, a consumer where the levels of incomes are not very high, it's our fundamental obligation to ensure that the Indian consumers have the best possible access on the most advantageous term to the international markets. Russian oil in India. India has 23 oil refineries, refining 249 million tons of oil in a year, making it the world's biggest refiner. Reliance Industries runs the world's largest refinery in Gujarat, where he has increased the purchases of Russian oil. Together with India's second largest refiner Nayara, of which Russian Rosneft owns 49%. Reliance imports 45% of the Russian crude that comes to India. Union Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas Hardeep Singh Puri also said, the Indian government has a moral duty to provide energy to its citizens and it will continue to buy oil from wherever it has to. India is not violating any laws. India is not breaching Western sanctions on Russia, including the price cap of $60 imposed on purchase of oil from Moscow. Government authorities have asked banks and traders to adhere to the rules, but Indian officials have not gone on the record to say they will support sanctions and the price cap imposed by the G7 nations. Hence, India is not showing any signs of curbing its large-scale oil imports from Russia. In May, India bought in 1.96 million barrels of Russian crude a day. The daily average hit records for 8 months in a row, according to the Press Trust of India. India began to boost oil imports from Russia in April 2022, less than 2 months after Russia invaded Ukraine. In the year through March 2023, India imported the daily average of 1.02 million barrels of Russian crude. That represents an enormous increase from the previous year and 20% of the country's overall oil imports, according to the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. As a result, Russia became the nation's largest oil supplier. By the way, India depends on imports for 80% of its crude consumption. India gains three benefits by ramping up oil imports from Russia. First, curbing inflation. Number two, improving its trade balance. And number three, diversifying supply. Now let's understand how the West is benefiting from this. It has diversified its oil suppliers, as its dependence on previously three major Middle Eastern producers, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, have declined from 53% to 47%. Modi's India's first policy seems to have helped Russia weather Western sanctions. But after a careful study, it is revealed that of India seems to have had benefits for others. Let me tell you how. While India has sharply increased imports from Russia, its purchase from other major suppliers have dropped. This had freed up more oil for the Western countries. These nations have apparently increased exports to countries other than India, including the member of the G7 and EU, European Union. The European Union let India do the dirty work of purchasing Russian oil to avert a full-blown crisis, and India has played the role perfectly. Neither the G7 nor the EU may publicly acknowledge India's contribution to price stability, but it has no denying that the country has played a vital role in preventing a global economic crisis. Despite India's purchase, Russia is still earning less than it did prior to the invasion from its oil exports, in part because of the additional cost and difficulties such as obtaining insurance to ship its crude way around the world. India is snapping up discounted crude oil from Russia, refining it and selling it, becoming a key supplier to Europe as it reshapes global fuel flows more than a year into Moscow's war in Ukraine. It emerged as a major supplier of petrol and diesel. Some of the refined Russian crude goes to Europe and elsewhere. India's petroleum product to the European Union rose 20.4% year on year between January and April, 11.6 million tons. So the question is, how is this even allowed? Despite the sanction on Moscow, this does not foul on European Union rules because the refined products are not deemed to have come from Russia. It also helps the group of countries to avoid supply problems, push up prices for consumers. The world will have a very hard time to live without Russian oil, says Vortex's chief economist David Wach. Cutting Moscow out completely would cause a deep recession